Growing up, my family never went to national parks. My first overnight backpacking trip wasn't until the summer after my senior year of high school. A few of my friends and I decided to walk 6 miles into a state park, only to get eyed up by a ranger and turned around because we were so clearly unprepared. It was probably the grocery bag full of loose bagels that gave us away, but despite our general cluelessness, the trip was awesome. Over the years, however, as I've read and hiked more, America's wooded parks began to unravel in front of my eyes. These pleasurable preserves were built for people who looked like me in the name of leisure, and eventually created an inaccurate vision of a world untouched by other humans. In reality, America's wilderness areas have a turbulent history. The land of some national parks like Glacier and Yellowstone was obtained through colonialism and violence, and the history of these parks is marred by disregard for treaties and the forced removal of people that lived on the land. Today I want to look at the origins of 2 national parks in order to historically contextualize and substantiate these claims. In 1895, 2 nations forged an agreement. The Blackfoot ceded roughly 800,000 acres of its land to the United States in return for a payment of $1.5 million over a 10-year period. In addition, the Blackfoot people were to retain hunting and gathering rights on the land. Part of the agreement read as follows: that the said Indians hereby reserve and retain the right to hunt upon said lands, and to fish in the streams thereof, so long as the same shall remain public lands of the United States, under and accordance with the provisions of the game and fish laws of the state of Montana. However, this cession was not without context. The Blackfoot Nation, really a collection of 4 semi-independent tribes, including the North Piegan, South Piegan, Blood, and Northern Blackfeet, was very strong in the early 19th century. However, by 1895, their numbers had dwindled to roughly 2,000 people. Diseases like smallpox, skirmishes with other indigenous nations in the United States, and most importantly, the quick decline of buffalo as a result of overhunting by mostly white Americans, forced the Blackfoot peoples into a corner. The Blackfoot were essentially pushed into selling parcels of land in order to support themselves in the absence of buffalo. The agreement with the United States forged in 1895 was accepted grudgingly by Chief Whitecalf, who stated, "Chief Mountain is my head. Now my head is cut off. The mountains have been my last refuge." With the establishment of Glacier National Park in 1910, however, this right to the bounty of the land was ripped away. 2 years after the park's creation, a ranger arrested Blackfoot hunters and warned that they will no longer be permitted in Glacier National Park, and if found within the park, they will be summarily ejected. In 1932, this disregard for the treaty was officially recognized by a U.S. district court, which decided that the land ceded under the treaty ceased to be deemed public after it became a national park. Thus, the 1895 agreement was slashed by a national park in the name of a pristine vision of nature. The Blackfoot Nation's right to hunt and fish on the ceded eastern section of the land was shunned in order for the park to appear untouched. In the case of Yellowstone National Park, the expulsion of the Crow, Bannock, Sheep-Eaters, and Shoshone peoples proved much more forcible and violent. Initially, the US government took legal routes to expel these nations from a land they wanted to look untrammeled. However, when that failed, law enforcement approached Native American nations with violence. According to an account in the 1894 annual report to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, William Manning, a Jackson Hole constable, deputized 26 men for the purpose of seeking out and arresting Native Americans that were hunting in the area. They eventually came across a Bannock camp and stripped the people of their goods, marching them at gunpoint out of the park. As they neared a heavily forested area, Manning's posse loaded their weapons, and some of the Bannock bolted in fear. The deputized men opened fire. An old man was killed and 2 children lost. The origins of Yellowstone and Glacier point to a much more complex history of national parks, one that expelled Native American nations from their lands in order to provide a pristine front for tourists. This history is essential to understanding the often untold aspects of America's wilderness areas. Back in high school, my 2 friends and I walked through the woods, enjoying the pleasantries of a state park, but that park was there for our use, for our pleasure. For many, that isn't the case. Native American practices of brush burning and game hunting were barred from places like Glacier so that 20th century recreationalists could experience the leisure and hardships of quote-unquote untrammeled land. The National Park Service has begun to recognize this darker legacy of their federally protected lands in recent years, but it's one that we need to come to grips with if we are to truly understand how to ethically and rightfully enjoy these constructed landscapes. If you're interested in learning more about Native American nations and national parks, I put some links in the description of books and papers that I found useful. As always, you can subscribe and support me on Patreon, and I will see you next Friday. Bye.